And so for debugging, there's a couple of pieces that'll be in here. There's some things I'm going to just glaze over because we don't necessarily need them for the final, but you should know how to be able to use those so that you can use them in the future. All right. So one of those being this first one here, you guys have done this in the past where you use try and accept statements, right? So try to do something. If it doesn't work, accept either blanket or accept on value error or type error or something in there. And you can raise your own errors in there as well. You also have the ability to raise your own exception errors. So if you want to write your own exception errors, you could do that. You could use the raise keyword and then call exception, and you can put whatever error message in there you want. So raise exception, this is an error message. Right? This can be handy if you're writing more advanced code and you need to write your own exceptions or be able to give your own error messages, things like that. That's what this is for. Okay. So you don't need to do a try and accept. You just need to say raise exception and then raise whatever error message you want to raise. That's not necessarily what we'll do for the final, so I'm going to let that go. There's also a traceback here. Traceback allows you to do exactly what we've done in the past, which was trace back to what lines were causing the issue and where that all came from. Again, we're not going to do that. You have the option of doing assertions. Assertions are used as a sanity check to make sure your code isn't doing something obviously wrong. There again, that's kind of a check and balance or doing a test within your code. You can use the assert keyword. Here, we won't use that for the final. So I'm going to glaze over that. What we will use for the final is logging. So in your final project, 20 points of your 100 points is logging. All right. Logging allows you to log error messages and things to a separate log file so that you can then go back and read that log file and see what your program's doing. Right now, everybody's just printing something like a variable, right? You print the variable so you can see what's actually in that variable when you're trying to troubleshoot or debug or something like that, right? This allows you to send it off to a log file so you can watch it in real time what's being sent out to the log file without it actually crashing your program. So it's really handy to kind of troubleshoot what's going on with your code. So with logging, it's a very simple setup. There's this one here. I'm not going to show you that because we want to use specifically the one that logs to a file. So I'm going to go down and show you that code, which is this one here. Oops, scroll back down. So you'll go to the section that says logging to a file. All right. If you do the basic logging, which is this one up here at the top, it will look very, very similar right here. This one will log to the screen, and we don't want to log to our own screen or to our console screen, right? We want this to go out to an external file for us. So you want to make sure you come down here and go to logging to a file. You literally copy and paste this, and you put it at the top of your script. So if I open up idle here, and we do a new file, we copy and paste that. Now, when I copy and paste that, it doesn't bring the formatting in correctly. Notice how this didn't curve like it's supposed to complete this. You need to go to this % and hit backspace, and it will tail it off over here to the right-hand side, and everything will be fine. You can come over here and go to logging, press enter, format, press enter, and now it squishes it on the screen so you can see it. All right. So you copy and paste it, you format it so you can see it like this. You're welcome to adjust the formatting if you guys are advanced and want to do some more active messages, but this is a very basic logging and it works just fine. If you want to change the logging file name, that's perfectly fine too. But you can just copy and paste this in and you have the initial setup for your logging. So what this does is it imports the logging module. We set up the basic config that says spit it out to this file name. We want our logging level currently set to debug, and we want to leave it debug for our final project. We'll talk about the different levels. And then this is the format. So it's going to give our date, time up here at the front. It's going to tell us what logging level is being reported, and then the actual message that's getting reported there as well. Okay. Again, simple copy and paste right out of chapter 3 or chapter 11. Yep, go to chapter 11, scroll down till you find logging to a file. So you'll scroll down and you'll see it right here where it says logging to a file. Yep. Or at the top of your final project, yes. It'll be required for your final. What's that? No. No, always put this at the very top because you're doing an import and it should be one of the first lines of code in your project. So you just copy and paste this at the top. Okay. So now that you have that in your project, we need to talk about the different logging levels. And there's a bunch of different logging levels that are out there. So when this prints out to the screen, or in this case to a file, it's going to look like this. You have the time, you have the level that's being debugged, and you have the error message that you wanted to have it printed out. Now, you get to design what this debug message is. You treat it much like a print. So if we look at this code that they have set up here, we have the initial setup, and then we have a logging.debug message that says start of the program. You could put logging.debug and stick this at the start of your program. What it's going to do is give you a log file that you want in order of things that are happening. Does that make sense? You want to be descriptive with this and overuse logging because then you're going to know what's going on in your program. If you just put start of the program and then never use a debug message after that, what good is the debug file, right? If you guys have ever called IT support or worked with somebody, what's the first thing I ask you to do? No, besides that. Yes, but no. Check the error, check the log file, what's going on, right? They want you to send those to them. The reason is you can pull a lot of valuable information out of that log file, all right? Which takes us to different logging levels, all right? And there's a whole chart of logging levels here, right here. So this chart actually has it in the inverse direction. So debug level is the lowest level for messaging. And I repeat, debug is the lowest level for messaging. And hint, wink, wink, pay attention for the quiz. All right. So debug's the lowest level. It's going to be used for the most minute amount of detail. So you usually care about these messages only when you're diagnosing problems, which means normally you would not set your debug level that you want to go to your log file as debug level. You want it to be set to something like warning level or error level, where it's only going to do those that are set at that particular level. So the highest level is critical errors, and those are ones that are immediately going to cause the program to crash. In other words, if this code executes, it is straight up going to stop the program and crash it, right? Error levels are ones that are just going to cause errors. The program is going to fail to do something, but it doesn't crash the program. Warning indicates a potential problem, but doesn't prevent any program from working, but it might do so in the future. Info ones are used to record information. So for example, if you guys are collecting input from a user and you print it out to the screen so that you can make sure what you're gathering from the user or what you expected, that information can go into a logging.info. That way, when you log it out to your file, it's in your file for info, but we don't need to necessarily store any additional information. The benefit of putting it into a logging.info is if you go back and get your log file and you can see what the user typed in, and maybe they typed in something that broke your program, you at least have record of what that user typed in, all right? And again, lowest level debug. So for your project, I want you to set it to debug. We want all the errors to show up no matter what level's in here, all right? And you're required to do one logging.debug and one logging.critical. Does anybody see what might be an issue if I require a logging.critical? Something has to break, right? And it doesn't just have to break, it has to crash the program. Well, what's the number one rule in your final project? Don't have anything that crashes, right? So we have to engineer a way that it would crash, but in a way that makes sense as to why it would crash. All right. And I'll show you guys how to do that with your midterms. All right. So what does that look like? If we come up here and look at our program, right? And say we have a print menu here, you don't have to copy what I'm doing here. I'm just giving you an example on the screen. And we do some code and then we say print, enter your name. Right? We're going to gather a name from the user, so something like input. And then we could test that input, right? So if we want a name, how would we sanitize that? It's a good test for you guys in your midterms. How would you sanitize a name input? Anybody remember what we used for names? As quiet as it is, it's going to be a long time grading these midterm projects. Any input should be in the white. There you go. Somebody got it over here. Okay, so you have Aaron who says use is alpha or regex. Is alpha isn't a bad one, but there's a specific one that I told you to use for names. So we put it in a while true, and we always put our print statement inside the while true. All right, we got our name. How do we verify this name is correct? Yes, you could use is alpha, but there's a better one for names. Is title. Good work, Tiffany. Tiffany. So we would say if name dot is title. Remember that title requires a capital letter followed by lowercase letters, right? It's meant for names. So if we say is title, now you got me saying is alpha. It's is title, then we can go ahead and do something with it, right? So we could say print, thanks for entering your name. And we could do that. Now we want to put this out to our log file. So in the very top here, we have print main menu. We could have something like logging.debug, and we're going to say start of the program. Right? The whole purpose of this is that it starts your log file and tells you we're starting at the beginning of your program. Right? You treat these just like print statements. So you say logging.debug, this .debug tells them what level this would print at, which means it's only going to show up if our logging level up here is at a debug level. If it's at a higher level, this would never send to the log, right? So we have logging.debug. We would use a logging.info in order to print out to our log what the user typed. So user typed something like this, a name, right? And this is an F string, so we need to put an F in there. And that allows us to go back in our logs and figure out what they typed in, all right? So if it errored, then we can figure out also what the user typed in so we know what they typed. So we might actually use this up here directly under our input so we know immediately what they typed, and then we can do our check on our name. So you may even do something like logging.debug, checking name for validity, something like that. And that way in your log file, we can check if it's been entered correctly. Everybody kind of see how that works? And here, if it is correct, we could do a logging.debug. Name is valid. Else, print out to the user, that is not a valid name. Please try again. Okay. If it is working, we need a break in here, right? And if this is not valid, it's going to start them back over. We would throw something in our logging.debug that would say user entered an invalid name. Try again. Okay. This is a very simple logging side of it. So I've used two different ones here. I've used logging.debugs and I've used a logging.info, right? Debugs are only going to show up in the case that we set everything to debug, but it will print everything higher than that. Does that make sense? It's kind of like golf. Lower is more, right? Lower is better. So in this case, the lower your logging level, remember debug's the lowest, everything above it, which is warning, critical, info, and what? Which one? Error, right? All of those are going to show up in the log file. If we set it to critical, what's going to show up in the file? Just criticals, right? Because there's nothing higher than a critical. If we set it to warning, then we would get what? Yes, warning, error, and critical. Okay, everybody understand how that works? Trust me, it's in the quiz. You want to know how that works. Okay, so you can use these. You can use all of them in your project. You can use just the debug and critical that's required. Doesn't matter. But one problem we have with this project right now, let's call this a function, and we're going to call it get name, right? And so anytime we want to get a name from the user, this is what we're going to get. And out of this break here, instead of a break, we're going to say return name. Now in our main program, obviously this needs to be before our even our start. Remember functions, you have your initial setup stuff that you import, then you have your functions, then you have the start of your actual program code. That's the format that your final project should be in. So we will just put a comment here so that we know this is the start of the program. Okay, so now that we have this main menu and we're not actually going to do a menu, we're just going to say, we'll call it main menu for now, but we're going to say get name, right? So get name, and we want to store this as the variable name for our project. When we do this, it's going to go back up here to this function, execute this function, keep them in there until they give us a valid name. Then it's going to return that name back to us to store here. Does everybody get how this little thing works? And you guys are doing something similar in all your projects. All right. So whether you're doing a text adventure game and maybe you're having them go to room 1, or they're going down path 2, or whatever they're going to in the functions, that kind of thing. Okay, the reason that we want to do this is in order to get our logging.critical, we're going to end up putting all of our functions into a separate file. So we're going to come in here. I'm going to store this in the right folder so I know what I'm doing. Let's do debug example. Okay. Now, what we want to do is take this function and put this in a separate file because it helps make our program a little cleaner. You guys probably have 10, 15 functions at this point, right? It's making it a little convoluted to see what goes where, how does that differ from my main code, et cetera, et cetera. So what we want to do is create a separate file. We go to new file. And in this new file, we're going to copy and paste this entire function into that new file. And then we're going to save this file, save as, in the same folder as our project, which is called debug example. We're going to call this my functions. We can call it whatever we want. We're just going to call it my functions. Now, if we run this code over here, we're going to get an error, right? Because it doesn't know where to go run get name. So what we need to do is import that into our main project, right? There's a couple different ways to do imports. You would do something like import my functions. All right. That brings everything that was in the other Python file into this file as if we copied and pasted it. Right. To execute this, though, we would have to say something like my functions dot get name. So if you think random, right? Say we import random, we have to call it with random dot randint, right? We're copying the random Python file into our project and having access to all those functions. We're doing the same thing here with our own functions file. So instead of having to call this my functions.get name, because you're probably going to have 100 changes in your project, right? You call all these functions from different areas, makes it way more complicated. What we can do is instead of saying import functions, we can say from my functions, import star. And what star says is give me everything. It imports it in. Now it's native to this program, meaning I can call get name as if it was copied and pasted right into this project. Everybody see how that works? So if I run this now, the first thing it does on that import is it copy and paste everything from my functions file back into my project. Relatively speaking, it doesn't actually do that, right? It just has access to those. And now that it's in there, we can see the program works. If I type in gibberish, it drops. Now, what's the problem here? It says logging not defined. So if we go back to our file we just created, which was called my functions, we go 360, our debug example, and this my functions example. Remember, we have a logging.info and logging.debug in here, but in this file, there's no such thing as logging, right? So at the very top of this, we need to import our logging. Even though we have it in our main file, we need to have it in the second file as well. So we're just going to copy and paste this whole thing into our second file. All right. Once that's in there, now it will take advantage of your configuration and run correctly. So we go in here. You'll notice that our program is functioning as we intended. So we're getting the error message here, and it's still not a valid name. I type in Jason. Thank you for entering a name. The program ended. At that point, you'll see we have a My Program log file. We double click on the log file, and we can see all of our error messages as we typed in. So now I have starting the program. Then I have the user typing in ASDF, says it's invalid. We can see our messages checking for validity. They didn't do something valid. Down here, they finally type something valid. It's valid and it's valid. So you can see as they're going through your project, if you want to keep track of them going left through the forest or right through the front door or whatever, if you keep that information in here, you know what path they took. That way, if they run into some weird wonky error, you know what path they took through your text adventure game. Or if you're doing something at the command line, something like that, and they spits out an error message, you can dump that to the log file so that it spits it out. So it's only checking for me to put a capital letter and lowercase letters afterwards. That's all it's checking for. So I could have put Sam, I could have put anything that has an uppercase and lowercase letters after. It's just looking for that format. So yeah, if I rerun it, I could say my name's Sierra or whatever. As long as it's capital letter followed by lowercase, it takes it. All right. So then is the format that we would bring it in. You put all your functions in this separate file. In your main file, you just do from functions import star. All right. Well, we still don't have a logging.critical. Well, what happens if I don't have this my functions file? Say this my functions file got misnamed or it's in a separate folder. So let's call it my functions 2. Now, if I run this program, I get an error message, right? Well, we can't have red error messages. That's going to cause us to lose 20 points on our project. So what we do is we wrap this import in a what? Not a while true, but try and accept, right? We're going to try to import it. If it doesn't work, we can at least write an exception out. So we would say try importing this. And if it goes successfully, we can either print something to the screen, which we don't need to do, but we may as well log it. We'll do a logging.debug and say myfunctions.py loaded successfully. Okay. Now on an accept, and we can write in a very explicit accept. In this case, it's a module not found error, right? So we could do accept on module not found error, and we could say print my functions dot py is missing. Then we could do a logging dot critical, and this is the same message. We're basically telling the user, hey, that file's missing. Then what should we do right after that? In the program, right? Because if we continue the program, we know it's going to fail. So how do we immediately end the program? Use the sys.exit. And if we do a sys.exit, what else do we need to do on our project? Import sys. Great. Now remember, you can tail some of these together. Like I could do this, import logging, comma sys. Don't do that. Python has now recommended that you put each one of those on their own imports. So put every module on its own import line. Okay. It will work, but Python wants you to do each one on its own line. All right, so we have this error message. You can accept on this whole error, or you could just do a blanket accept. Either one's okay. Now, say you have room 2, and room 2 has a whole bunch of functions that are just associated with room 2. Instead of dumping everything off to a file that's called my functions, you may want to dump it off to a file called room 2, put all your functions associated with room 2 in there, then import room 2 at the very beginning. And you would have this block of code for every file you want to import. Well, why would you want to do that? Well, say you have 1,000 lines of code because you have a massive text adventure game, right? If you break everything off into separate files, it's much easier to go find that code and update that little piece. So if you know you have an error with room 2, I just go to room 2's file. If I have room 3, room 4, room 5, etc., it's much easier for me to add. If you guys play video games, you guys have played video games and you see it has a bunch of different files, right? Same thing. Those data files are specific to that portion of the game. We could do the same thing here in our Python file. Same way when you guys are importing third-party modules. So say you guys are using some outside program. What's one that we had to pip install in this class? Paperclip, right? Say you're using Paperclip and we have to install that. You would do something like try import Paperclip. And then if it works, you could say debug Paperclip imported successfully. But if that fails, we could print that to the user. Paperclip module not found. Please install it via pip. The command is, and then we can tell them what the command they need to run. So pip install Paperclip. Something like that. And the logging file, again, we use a logging.critical here because the program is about to crash. We can copy and paste this in. And then we do our sys.exit. So anybody that's using third-party modules in your project, this is how you should write that in. You may be doing something different like import Paperclip as Pi or something goofy because you're using a specific module. Same way, just write it in this way. This is how you tell me that I need to pip install something. So if I run your code and I don't have that installed, it's going to tell me that right off the bat. Right? So if I run this code and it says my functions is still missing, right? Notice how it ended the program and closed it out. What we need to do is make sure that we have something like print program will now exit. Okay, something to tell the user what's going to happen. My functions file is missing, program will now exit. If we go update this back to the right file name, and we come back here and run it. Now we go back to our regular scheduled program. There we go. And if we check our text file, we may need to reopen. We can see it always adds to it. So it's a long log file, right? If we wanted to reset it every time, there's a setting in basic config that will just overwrite it every time. That way it's a fresh start. Right now, it's just tacking it in there. So we can see these are the first couple times we ran it. Then we ran it and got 2 critical error messages. Then we ran it and it got to load successfully. This is a great way to debug your project and make sure you know what's actually working. So if I were you, I would do everything that somebody is typing in, spit that out to a logging.info. You already have a print statement for something there, right? Just copy and paste it in as a logging statement so it puts it in the log file for you. Treat logging.critical, logging.debug, etc., just like print statements. This is why I was telling you guys, if you guys actually commented your program throughout the whole thing, copy and paste your comments right into the logging statement. Now you know where you're at in the project. That's the reason I had you over comment, so to speak, on the midterms, is so now you can turn those comments right into logging statements and you're done with your project. Make sense? Anybody here or online have any questions on that? So what you would do is move any of your functions off to a second file like we did, and then import them into your main project. So when you turn in your project, you'll end up with your main Python file, and you'll end up with a functions.py. Does that make sense? Right, so your critical is when we go to import your functions into this project. So here's your, yep. So in the event that your file is missing or misnamed, that would cause an error. That's why it's in this try and accept format. Third-party modules, you do this one, where you just try to import it, do a debug, and do a critical if it's not found. All right. It's the easiest way to get your 20 points is just copy what you see on this screen. And yes, that's where most people will go, well, my program never crashes. You have to introduce a place it would crash. But the whole idea is you're not really introducing a place it would crash, you're now organizing your Python files. So instead of having one file with every function under the sun in it, then your main code, start breaking it out into separate files so it's easier to manage. Okay. Now, when you submit your final project, you need to take all those files together, zip it, and then submit it to me when we get to that part of the final project. So almost everybody's final project should be a zip file because you should have more than one in here. Now, the only time you may not have more than one is if you use third-party modules and you don't have your own functions, and it's just testing this whether or not the third-party modules installed. You would need something like this. Or when you were doing your third-party imports, you just wrap them in this and do a logging.debug in your main file. Yep. It could have some, but you may want to group some of your other functions in a separate site. So for example, like your code, you may leave your actual printer function in the main one, but you probably want to kick off the ones associated with different paths off to a separate file. Just know that if you call like that main printer one from those other files, then it makes sense to move the other function over. Otherwise, it doesn't know how to get to it. Now, that comes back to troubleshooting. Say I have a typo in my functions file now. So let's go into my functions file. And say I did something completely wonky here and it's not right? So for example, I have an extra tab over here, or this is all off, right? And I save this and then I run it over here in my main project. Notice how it says my functions file is missing. Well, it's not really missing. I have errors in my other file. So if you're here and you're like, well, it's not missing, I got it there. What you need to do is come back to your main project, comment this section out. So it's easy. You just do 3 of these and then 3 of these, right? And then copy and paste this line and put it above that. And then run this project. At that point, you're actually going to get the error message that tells me I have unexpected indents. So if you're getting this and it's saying that file's missing, even though you know it's not missing, it's not. What it's doing is trying to import that file. You have errors in that file. And because you have this in a try and accept, it just blanket says it's missing, right? Especially if we do a blanket accept here and don't accept on module import error, then it's going to catch all and do that. So that would be another reason to use a very specific module import error. Otherwise, you would get the red text, but we don't want the red text anymore. So you do this, you come back to your main file, which is your functions file. You fix the issues. And again, this is going to tell you where your issues are, right? So line 6, okay, I'll go check line 6 and make sure I don't have bugs. Turns out my indentions are all messed up. It's working, save it. Close the log file. The execution and run this again. And then once this works, like it's doing now I need to go back to my main file, take this line out, take out my triple comments, and go back to using this code like we intended. That's one thing I tend to forget to show everybody, and they troubleshoot why it's saying a missing file. It's not missing, you just have errors in the other file. That could come from your copy and paste, that could come from whatever. Okay. Anybody got any questions on logging, debug? Trust me, once you start using it, you'll be like, this is so nice to go to my log file and figure out what's going wrong every single time I run it. The more liberal you are with using your logging.debugs and criticals and all of that, the better your logging file is going to be. So if right now you have a bunch of stuff printed out to the screen, but it kind of looks ugly because it doesn't need to be printed out, send it to your log file. Change that print statement to a logging.critical or a logging.info and you're done. That's all you got to do in your project. Right? If you don't do this file name portion, aka you copy and pasted the wrong one, it's going to do something like this. We're going to put those debug messages on the screen, and we don't want that. All right, so make sure you have the file name portion in here so that it spits it off to a file. And again, you can adjust the format it puts it in the file. So if you look at this format, you can see how this is all going out. All right. Those of you that might be advanced in Python, there is a thing called logger and get logger and all of that. It's handier when you're using multiple files. If you figure that out, great. I won't count off for that, but just use this style of logging for now. All right. Notice how I had to copy and paste between the two, the whole basic config line between two files. Just do that and not use get logger and all that. Right. So if I'm doing any kind of logging inside my functions, like I was in here, then I have to have this at the top of my file. Does that make sense? So it's at the top of both files. No, you would just put this in here, and then yes, you would have to import that into your main project file. Yep. This only is required if you use this inside your function. If you don't do the logging inside your function, then you don't have to have any of this. So it depends on what you're doing in your project. Okay. So for that portion, again, I'll bring it up here just so you guys can see it. You guys should have access to the final project. Nope, it's not open yet, but I'll show you the rubric. So for this rubric, you'll see this whole 20-point section, a fifth of the project, is that you're required to have logging.debug and logging.critical. And so it's 10 points for having the initial basic config, which again is a copy and paste out of the chapter text, right? It's not hard. Copy and paste, 10 points. That's 10 points of your actual final. The other 10 points is 5 points for having a debug, 5 points for having a critical. You technically just need one of each. You could do the bare minimum, put one in of each, do the top part the way we told, you're done. But it would be wise to use it throughout your entire project. But make sure you have at least a debug and a critical. You can have info warnings, all the other ones if you want. It's entirely up to you. And those of you that are coding big projects that are going to probably go beyond this class, you'll probably want to do that. That way you have that kind of error message moving forward. All right. The other 20 points is your OOP stuff. We'll talk about that here coming up. And then this first 60 points up here at the top is very similar to the old project. So it executes with no errors, has flow control, aka has functions, lists, dictionaries, and it's all well documented, meaning that you have your initial comments at the top, you have the block comment that tells me what your project is, and you have comments throughout the program. That will get you your whole 100 points. Even if you have all this, but the program falls flat on its face, you'll still end up with an 80, right? As long as you have all these other points, you're fine. Don't do that. But what I don't like seeing is somebody's like, oh, I just forgot the logging. Well, that took you all of 5 minutes to put into your project and you just lost 20 points. That's now an 80 on your final project because you didn't copy and paste it in. So please do that. That's why I'm leaving this recording going. For those that are listening to the recording, copy and paste. Where do I find that? Come back out here, go to automate the boring stuff, scroll below this table, and there's a section here called logging to a file. I grab this, I copy it, I go to my file, and I paste it in at the top. When I paste it, it's not going to paste correctly. Remember, I have to go to this percent, backspace, and then I can format these where they align straight down. You have to make sure that you don't just copy and paste that in and forget to go test your project after that. It won't work. This part here will get you the 10 points. Then you need to have in your main file this section so that you have at least a debug and a critical here. Right? From there on out, you can have debugs and criticals throughout your project, or warnings or errors or whatever. Right? If you look in the rest of this section, it's going to talk about the Mu debugger. I won't cover that, but it is handy. They have things like breakpoints and such in here. Because we're not using Mu and we're using idle, what that allows you to do is if I get to this chunk of code here in my project, right? Let me undo what I did here. Go. And say before I get them to do the input part, which is right here, I can insert a break. And what that will do is stop the program from executing once it reaches that part. So to do that, we can go to run. I need to turn on the break here. Go to run module. That's not what I want, but yes, it is. Let's go back to this. Run module, hit OK. And on this, if I go to debug and I turn on my debugger, okay, fine. All right, in this screen, I go to debug and debugger. And with my debugger turned on, if I go back and run my program, it runs each line of code, and I can step to each line of code as it goes through the program. So this is a great way of testing your program. If you're getting stuck at some point, you can keep going step, step, step till you find the line of code that causes an issue. Right? I can step it, I can hit over and it goes through that chunk. Like in this case, it's importing all the logging stuff. Or if I hit go, it'll go and just start the whole program and continue on. Right? So there's some debugging that you can turn on. It's really handy if you need to check out a certain piece of code. And how did I do that? Again, I just run it to where I get this terminal prompt. Like this, I stop my program, go up to debug, and I can turn the debugger on. And then from there, I can rerun my program. What's nice is it will tell you what your variables are. So if I look at my stack, locals, and globals, I go ahead and run my program. Look right here, I have no local variables, but I do have some global variables. So let's step till we actually type in our name. Now you can see I have a local variable called name. So it's waiting for me to do something in the project, which is here. I need to keep going steps. A lot of import stuff on that. Let's just take go. Okay, so now it wants me to put in name. I put in JSON. And over here in the debugging, it would have that in the locals as JSON so I can see what all my variables are as I'm going along. It also has all these other global variables down below. And in this case, because we're using a global variable, JSON, there would be one down here for that. Okay. All I need you to focus on is using the logging function out of this chapter. Anybody else got any questions? Online? You guys all good online? Okay. Stop the recording.